Okay, I'm back on the Talk Music podcast. It's a very special occasion because we're discussing the life and the times of the one and only Ginger Baker. So we thought, who are we going to get on to discuss this? We've got a drummer and we've got a jazzer. So that kind of sums up Ginger Baker's legacy, I suppose. Joining me right now, we've got first and foremost fellow Scot, Linzi Ronain Miller. Linzi, how are we?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Can't complain, never do, especially when I get the opportunity to chat to none other than the other person on the call as of right now, Mr. Mike Smith. Mike, aside from the fact that you've got to gig with me this week, how are you?
I'm doing all right, yeah. Very good. Looking forward to that.
I got in touch with the two of you and I said, I tell you what I want you to do, watch Beware of Mr. Baker. I think my favourite film ever. Things have grown arms and legs, and today we're going to get the opportunity to chat to Nettie Baker, of course, Ginger Baker's daughter, who has a fascinating story to tell. And with that in mind, we're going to cover the film, we're going to cover her life as well, because she's got a fascinating story, coupled with the fact that Ginger Baker's story is arguably even more fascinating, and it's all going to be intertwined. Mike, the film, Beware of Mr. Baker, what were your thoughts having watched it today?
Well, I've watched it several times, but I reminded myself today, I spent a couple of hours with it this morning, and I always get different things from it, you know. But of course, he's just so passionate about his music, but at the cost of everything else in his life. And that was it, really. It was a sort of cautionary tale, really, that it doesn't have to be everything, but for Ginger, it really was. Yeah, it's a slightly sort of depressing tale in a way as well, really. Yeah, I always find it fascinating every time I see it.
It really is. It's fascinating to say the least. So, Linzi, just as a drummer, what do you think of Ginger's drumming as a whole? One of the greats?
It's like hard to sum up. He was phenomenal. And Ginger Baker, I always used to just think toms. You know, literally that's what came into my head, was just like the toms, the African drumming. But it was obviously so much more than that as well. I didn't realise to the extent as a musician that he was as well. And just a heavy jazz drummer, because I will admit, back in the day, I just associated him as a rock drummer. Very naive, didn't really know much about him. But he was just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, what a phenomenal player. Honestly, I can't even sum up just how great he was, you know.
So, Mike, you touched on the point there. It was all or nothing for Ginger. Do you think it had to been that way in order for him to make those? Don't know if he would call them sacrifices per se, but did it have to go to that extreme for us to be left with that legacy, as it were?
Well, I think it did, you know, because he really just pushed all the boundaries, didn't he? Without people like him that are basically obsessive characters, then things don't get pushed. You know what I mean? But yeah, it was just fascinating to watch, you know, how that came from the jazz idiom and kind of straight into the rock world. As you say, Linzi, it was very, very Tommy what he was doing. You know, he's kind of really into the African influence, and he goes on about that. And indeed, he ended up living there and playing with some of the greats from that period of time. But again, you know, to give that much dedication to your art and your craft, to basically just be able to up sticks and move to a different continent. I mean, that is a special kind of commitment, isn't it? You know,
and a good few times over at that, by the way, to different continents and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
Mike, one more for yourself, just relating to the kind of jazz world, who are kind of out of the three of us, I would say, probably fair to say, you're the closest to being in that world with a lot more regularity anyway. So just focusing on him as a jazz drummer, Linzi mentioned him in the rock world. But as a jazz player, how highly do you rate him when it comes to that style? Because that takes a massive dedication to be in that world at such a high level.
Yeah, I mean, to be on a gig with Ginger Baker, which is unfortunately something I've never had an opportunity to play with him, but I've been in the room when he's been playing. And I think it's 2015 I went to go and see him in the Jazz Confusion band. I mean, it was just 110% from the world go. You know, it was like straight out of the doors into the fire, really. You know, it was just full on. I remember being like, okay, it's just a force. He was saying, I remember something I picked up on today, which I hadn't picked up on before, he was saying that, you know, people assume he's playing things really, really fast, and he's not actually, but he's got a lot of independence. So he's playing a lot of different things, which give the impression that it's 4 times as fast as it really is, you know. But I think that's actually quite a humbling thing, or he's being very humble by saying that, because it was quite quick anyway. But the energy is there because he's got this incredible independence. But, you know, and he also, other people in the film say there was no blueprint for what he did. He invented that whole thing. I mean, he really was at the top of it. You know, he took influence from all places, from the different cultures and things, but really it was him. He's the archetypal rock drummer, you know, but he kind of spanned all of the different styles together.
And out of all the influences he took from, he certainly influenced a whole generation, certainly a lot of drummers. So with that in mind, Linzi, how much of a testament is it to him, his playing and his career, that there's so many of arguably the greatest drummers ever in that film, in that piece, talking at length about how great Ginger was? How much does that say about him?
Well, I actually thought that the funny thing about that was it was mainly all kind of rock and metal drummers that were actually speaking, and he was quite kind of like, I'm not a rock drummer, you know, kind of thing. I'm a jazzer. But you can just see, I mean, look who was in that, do you know what I mean? Some of the biggest bands and the biggest household name drummers were inspired by him to actually pick up the drums, and that's one of the biggest compliments that you can get. And it just shows like how, you know, just how idolized and how important that he actually is or was as a drummer, you know.
We're back on the Talk Music podcast, and it is our privilege to welcome the daughter of a Hellraiser, as it were, and that's my first of many plugs of your books and all the rest of it. Nettie Baker, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, and hello to everyone.
So we'll do the plugs throughout, okay? But the books in question that everybody should get, that we're gonna give some nuggets of little kind of bits of stories today. Give us the plugs for the books, and where can everybody get them?
Well, they're mainly nearly all available on Amazon or Smith's, any online store, but the best place to get them is Wymer.co.uk, which is WYMER, and they ship worldwide as well. But you can get them, just type the titles in, and there's sort of the 4 really. I wrote Hellraiser, which is not with my publisher, but they do also sell it. So that's Hellraiser, which is his autobiography, which I ghost wrote in 2009. And then the 3 others are my 2 memoirs, which is Tales of a Rock Star's Daughter, Tales of a Rock Star's Daughter. And then for fans, there's a coffee table book called Full Cream, which has got 3 posters in it. And obviously I'm sort of in charge of that to make sure the facts are straight. So, but it's very popular. So.
Yes, and there might be a lot of fact checking today. I've done my very best to research and all the rest of it. So apologies in advance if I get a couple of little things wrong. I'm very confident you'll correct me though.
Yes, I will.
Yes, because there's a lot of misconceptions, and I can't wait to talk about all of that, right? But one of the kind of quotes from you, and I'd love to delve a little bit more into it, was, I think I'm right in saying you might have been the first person to hear Cream.
Well, the thing was, they formed in our living room in Neasden, so they came for their first jam in our living room. So I get home from school and the room's full of amps and guitars, and they were raving because, you know, all the kids in the fields behind had come up and could hear the music and were dancing, and they thought, wow, this must be great music. So they were buzzing from that. When I came in from school, I was 5. And, you know, I remember that well, because it's quite a disruption to your home life to have loads of noisy musicians with amps and guitars all going on when you just want your tea. You know, yeah, so the only people there were Jack, Eric, Ginger, my dad, me and my mum. And the only 2 people left alive from that day is me and Eric. So, yeah, I think that's quite a privilege, really.
It certainly is a privilege. So I think I've got that right. I think we can say that you were the first person to hear Cream, which is absolutely amazing. So that alone would be enough for you to have such a great story to tell. But of course, we know there's so much more. So with that in mind, you're 5 years old. What kind of awareness do you have at the time of like your dad is a kind of how would you describe him? You know, a titan, an absolute phenom on the kit. How much of awareness do you have at this time, and or what point do you realize that this guy's something special?
Well, I think, any of us, what you grow up with is normal to you. And, from an earliest age, the sound of African drums were booming along when I was trying to get to sleep. So drums are obviously new. My dad was always practicing. Once he got with Graham Bond organisation, which became very successful, we had press attention. And we had people, artists and musicians and people in and out of the house. But I was a pop girl. I was twisting to the Beatles on the radio. I was thrilled when I met the Moody Blues. For me, like there's an article somewhere in my archive I've got where my dad just says, "Oh, ask my daughter about the pop. She loves it. She knows all the bands, Freddie and the Dreamers and all of them, Ferry Cross and Mersey." All of that, so I was really a big Beatles fan. So I think I found his sort of stuff, was obviously a bit too adult for me. My mum went out and bought me Eleanor Rigby when it came out, the single. That's what I was into. But yes, I was aware of it, definitely. And that made for, quite a difficult, what my books talk about is that identity thing where you're in one world and another world at the same time.
Could you expand on that?
Well, it's just about, and that's why I became a punk. So my second book, More Tales, is about being a second wave punk in the 80s in London. But it's just that you don't fit in either world. So, you're in this rock star world doing all that, and then you're in normal world where, and that as life went on, that became more and more pronounced, and it did sort of cause quite a lot of, it is a sort of an identity sort of crisis, really. Where do you fit in? And then when much later, when there was no money, well, where do you go? Who are you with? So punk was good because you could be anybody and you were accepted.
I get that now. Thanks very much for clearing that up. So
okay.
As you're telling this story, if people are watching it, they can see it. If you're listening to the audio, let me just tell you, Nettie's telling these stories with a big smile on her face. So correct me if I'm wrong, though, this is a really happy time, right? So you're fine.
It's not so much a happy time as things. It's like gallows humor. To me, it's, it's absolutely. I always say it's like if you get a rock star father, I had to get the booby prize one, It's like, no. Because someone said, my partner said to me the other day, well, you have got a rock star father. I was like, I'd much rather have had a normal dad like you, mate, much rather.
Right, okay, so we'll talk about this a little bit if that's okay, right? So and we'll get to it. But one thing I really wanted to ask, so do you have any memories that Cream performed the last gig at the time, of course, at the Royal Albert Hall? Any memories of that? Did you? I think you were too young to be at the event. What was going on?
No, I went to all the events, all the tours
really?
in America from their first.
Wow!
About their second tour, I was at all the tours, and I went to the Whiskey a Go Go. I've been everywhere. I've been dancing. There's an actual photograph of me that I've got. It's not in the book because the publisher made a mistake, didn't put it in. But I mean, I post it a lot on the Ginger Baker Facebook page. It's the one with the blue tick. That's us. If me with Rod Stewart, P.P. Arnold, B.P. Fanlon, backstage Windsor Jazz Festival, 1967. And I was at the Royal Albert Hall. Goodbye. I remember it well. My auntie was there holding his spare trousers. And we were in a box, but next to a speaker. So I remember being absolutely, completely deaf when I got home. So I went to the Roundhouse. They did a Roundhouse gig December the 30th, 1966. So I'm on the wall at the Roundhouse because I was there as a punk as well. So they've put me up saying on their 50 years of the Roundhouse. So and I can remember being in the Roundhouse because as a child, if you have those experiences that are really different, they're very vivid. So they really imprint themselves on your imagination. And when we went to the States, when I must have been 6, I had to keep a diary because I was out of school. So I've still got that. And it's all of the things. I wore my silver dress. I saw Daddy play. We went to a restaurant. Eric had a lobster that had been boiled. So, you know, spirits. And so we're talking about Billy Preston, you know, because I don't know, it was his birthday or anniversary of his death or something yesterday. And I remember being in a hotel room with Billy Preston and they were all taking drugs. And someone said to me, oh, well, you know, you might have been there, but people acted differently around the child. I was like, no, they didn't. My mum said I was often on the end of a party and she realised suddenly they just passed the joint to me. I was just on the end of the line. And she was like, I think you need to go to bed now.
Nettie, before we go any further, I think we're all realizing this. Please, this has to be this whole thing. This has to be part one of many times that you come back and chat with us, because there's going to be so many things that I'm having to glaze over just now, right? But we're going to get you back. This is emotional blackmail here, okay?
Okay.
So, right. So you're mentioning differently. Rod Stewart to your right, Eric Clapton to your left, and the whole bit, right? So, given this is something you touched on, this is the norm to you, right? At a really young age. So let me ask you this: has there been anybody at all that you've been starstruck by?
Yes, my two throughout my life. One in 1977 and one in 2018. The two are people that I'm massive fans of. So, and they're diametrically opposite, really. And one of them was Elton John, because he sang the soundtrack to my life. You know, I mean, massive early Elton John. So when I met him at a party of Eric Clapton's in 1977. And that's in my book, Tales of, the story of that. And that was, I'm still thrilled by that. And then in 2018, I met John Lydon, you know, so, and, you know, obviously he's king of punk to me, you know, really big. And he was so nice to me. And just like, I didn't even know what to say. I was thrilled. So yeah, those two definitely. And then I suppose in retrospect, the fact that, you know, I sat on Jimi Hendrix's lap that's pretty cool, I think.
That's insane.
That's pretty cool to say the least. So we're going to talk about Hendrix in his lap in a little second, right? But let me talk about John Lydon, as you just mentioned him there. At the start of the film, beware of Mr. Baker, Lydon's quoted as saying, in reference to Ginger himself, may the road rise with you, he helped me raise my road. Okay, so we all know the story that Ginger played on, of course, I think one track for Pill. Can you talk to us about the relationship between Ginger and John Lydon? It seemed he was hitting it. It goes a little bit deeper than that. I don't know for sure. What do you know about it?
Well, it's quite hard for me to unpick, because at the time that he did that, we were punks in Harrow, and he was my dad was very anti-punk. And so he did not tell us that he was doing that, because obviously he thought, ooh. So I did not know about this until much, much later, that's what he'd done. And when I was a fan of the Sex Pistols, I didn't know this. I knew he'd gone out to record because my sister went to look after the horses and had an accident, but we didn't know this at the time. So, and then later on, my dad had sort of said, oh, I never met John Lydon, and I just went into the studio. And that's not actually true, because in Lydon's book, both his books, he says, or in his Anger is an Energy, he says that he did meet him and saw him in the studio. And then I have now got a letter, I've got all my dad's letters that he sent to my brother, in which he said, oh, I really liked him, and I liked a lot of his lyrics. So he didn't elucidate on that with me, because he knew I was a punk and I liked punk, so he was too embarrassed, obviously, which is quite like him. And so when I met Lydon, he was like, I was quite scared of your dad. And I was just so thrilled, because when he was on the film, I thought, this is great for me, because John Lydon may actually speak to me. I might be lucky enough that he might actually talk to me. I went to see him at the 100 Club, and his manager guy said, yeah, come back. And I knocked on the door. I said, I'm Ginger Baker's daughter. And he dragged me in the door. I was like, oh my God. I honestly didn't know what to do with myself. And he was fantastic. He was so nice. So nice. So yeah, I mean, they obviously did have some sort of a relationship, and I know that my dad obviously was really pleased with the work he did, but he worked with Tony Williams. They were both drumming on that record, and people always get muddled up which one's which, and him and Tony Williams used to have a laugh about that and say, that was me, and they thought it was you, and you know, so that's as much as I know about that story.
Interesting. It really is fascinating stuff. We're having a great time here. See these two here that are on this call, they're usually so loud, so vocal about everything, but they're just quiet and they're in awe of all these stories, I'm sure.
Yes.
So you mentioned Jimi Hendrix. Tell us about this story. What is going on here?
Well, I tell the story. The story comes in my second book, More Tales, because it comes in the middle of the eviction story when we lost the big house, we got evicted. And I sort of look back. It's a sort of, prolepsis or whatever they call it in English lit. But it's my dad, Hendrix, he'd become friendly with Hendrix. I mean, he'd known him quite a long way through, and he says and tells the stories. A whole chapter on Hendrix in Hellraiser. So he tells a story about him having a threesome with Hendrix's women and all the rest of it. But then Hendrix comes to dinner with Kathy Etchingham, is who it was. Apparently, she said she would sue my dad if he mentioned her name. But anyway, it was Kathy Etchingham. Came to dinner, and he was in the living room. I was upstairs in bed, and I knew there was someone famous in the house. By this time, it was not long before he died. It was 1970. So the summer of 1970. And so by this time I was 9, so I was a bit more like, someone famous in the house. So I came downstairs and thought, you know what kids do, can I have a glass of water? And I looked through the crack in the living room door, and Hendrix was directly opposite me on a chair, and he just said, come here, and beckoned me over. And he said, oh, what's your name? And I sat on his lap for about half an hour he just was just a really nice guy.
Wow, sorry, it's very difficult to kind of have my jaw completely dropped at this. It's unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. So one of Hendrix's favorite guitar players is, of course, Eric Clapton, and Hendrix, I think, he's the band he wanted to jam with when he came over here was, of course, Cream, and I'm saying something that a lot of people know, of course. So I'm going to pass it over to Linzi in a little minute, but one thing I've got to know before that. Do you think that Eric looked up to Ginger at this particular time? Because the relationship's very interesting over the years.
I think, they were very, very close friends, and they remained close friends to the end. So that there's a lot of misconception out there in the world of myth. There's a lot of misconception about Eric and Jimi Hendrix. I mean, they were close friends. Hendrix looked up to Clapton. This, I've seen Hendrix play, I'm going to go and shoot myself. It's just absolute complete rubbish. None of that happened or is true. And, early days, Eric looked up to my dad, because there's one of the Cream documentaries, an early one made in the 90s, they both, Jack and Eric, who were younger than Dad, said, he had a wife, a child and a rover. That's the thing, he had a rover car, and so they thought he was like Mr. He'd been around, he'd done a thing, and he had, because he played, 1958 he was touring Sweden with Sister Rosetta Tharpe, so he'd done a lot already by the time they got together with him. But I think Eric did have respect for my dad to the end, definitely.
Of course, and we'll get back to that when we talk about the Cream reunion, a fantastic story that you tell about a little bit of a row one day, but we'll leave that as a cliffhanger for now, and we'll revisit that. Linzi, over to your good self.
Hi, Nettie. So
nice.
Hi,
Linzi. I love the cat.
Oh, I'm just, yeah, I know. A couple of cats here and a dog somewhere.
I'm really enjoying it. Yeah, I've got 3 cats in my life, so.
Oh, amazing. So just, you mentioned obviously about losing the house and stuff, so I don't want to get too personal, but in watching the film I was actually quite shocked at sort of Ginger's personality as such, and I just wondered kind of how did you kind of feel about him growing up? Obviously there was addiction and stuff as well, and I've had that in my family, like with my brothers and my dad. And then I know that it's really, really hard, it's really tough. So I was just wondering how you kind of saw your dad, and how you felt about him growing up.
Well, as I said earlier, the norm is the norm for whatever you are. There's a lot of things you can think about when you're older. I mean, I went into this by accident. Apparently there's a Glaswegian writer who writes about sort of rough times, a woman, and it said, she had her adverse childhood experience, score was 8, and that really means that you're very damaged. And I thought, I wonder what that is. And so I did it, and mine is 6. Any more than 4 and you'll you've had it. And mine is 6, which sort of explained a lot of things later. So that's how you're affected as a child. But no, I mean, Tales of a Rockstar's Daughter, although it starts when I'm a teenager and sort of looks back again, but it's no, I think as a small child I was afraid of my dad, but mainly because my parents argued so much. And my grandmother said that, you know, my mother rang up one day and said, "Can you take her? She won't. We've had an argument and she won't stop crying." Things like that. Some of my friends were scared of him. He was just a larger than life character to the end of his life, where absolutely everything was a full scale drama every minute.
Yeah, I can see that a lot in the film.
Yeah, but he could be. I mean, the trouble with the film is it was made by, I mean, Jay, I know Jay really well. He did a great job. He submitted the Joe Strummer film as an example. You know, The Future Is Unwritten with the bonfires, which is a great film. And I thought, yeah, you've got the right idea. But Jay paid money. My dad's wife and my dad asked money. They needed money. He had spent all the reunion money by that time. So my dad was not in control of that film. And other people, high up people, were saying to me, it's not always that good for the legacy because he's got no control of it. So there was that. So my dad was feeling pissed off, bitter and twisted at the time it was being made, which made him come across worse. But I think the outtakes at the end are more the dad I know. You know, hello, spring will be a little bit late this year. You know, if there were bloody this many straws and one short one, you will get the short one every time. You know, and those were the sort of things he used to say to you all the time. So that's very much him. But when I knew him as a teenager and I hung out with him all the time, which is what my first book, Tales, is about, he was really good fun and we got on really well. So perhaps not so good for a young child, but I mean, he tried. He used to take me places and do stuff. He taught me to ride a bike like normal dads do, running up and down the road after me. So, you know, it's a complicated question to answer and it's always conflicted. You know, some of the things are great and some of the things are not so great. And that's life, really, isn't it?
Every parent really, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thing. Yeah. That's quite, and that's kind of nice to hear as well, to be fair. You know, I kind of figured, you know, everything isn't all black and white in the film, but you know, I think for me as well, it was kind of frustrating watching it because he was such a talent. He was so phenomenal, and it was like kind of throughout the years, people weren't really wanting to work with him, you know, with his sort of attitude, I suppose. And I was just thinking, man, that's just nuts. I couldn't believe that people were pulling away from him, you know.
Well, it was, you know, both my parents were very difficult people to reach in that way, and they had some sort of, you know, PTSD of their own, I think, from World War II or whatever. Not everybody was affected, but, you know, he lost his father early, all that. But they had this sort of very cut off your nose to spite your face attitude. You know, people, when you're a star, people always fawn around you, you get sycophants, and then also you become a cartoon character of yourself. So it was okay when he was a cash cow. They encouraged it, the office, everywhere. And I've got letters where they're sort of, oh, Mr. Baker's got a short fuse. And lots of people said, oh, if he swore at me, I'd be delighted. Well, we used to say, no, you can't do that now. But people who wanted to take advantage of him, you know, played that up. So, yeah, it wasn't, and he was massively talented in lots of ways. He was a great writer. I mean, the middle part of that book, he was actually his. He wrote it, and I didn't have to edit it at all. I mean, he wrote very similar to me. He was a great writer. He was a fantastic artist. He could have designed all his record covers instead of that last jazz one when they put that absolutely horrific picture of him up, which he absolutely hated. So I was like, well, why didn't you just design the cover? You know, so much. But he was always with the wrong people.
Oh.
And the right people, as you quite rightly said, they just couldn't cope with it because he'd be ringing you up every 5 minutes, mainly asking you for money. I mean, we were giving him money all the time. His own mother was giving him money. He was always asking for money because he'd given it to somebody else. And in the end, you think, oh, no, please. I mean, someone told me a story about he went to George Harrison's house once and George Harrison was like hiding behind the door going, oh, no, it's his Ginger again. Please help me. So, you know, those sort of people, after a while, you do think, oh God, I need to lie down.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for answering that. That was very.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Love the
we're
cats.
we're gonna pass the mic now.
I just wondered, really, because you had such a unique vantage point from being where you are and who you are. What did you learn from him musically?
Well, I have to say my musical ability is near zero. My siblings are both very musical. And obviously, if you go and check out my brother, he lives in America at the moment, but hopefully he'll come over here and tour. You know, you can see his website, cowiebaker.com. He is absolutely phenomenal. He played at the tribute that Eric did for him at the Hammersmith Apollo in February 2020, and that's up on YouTube. I mean, it's illegal, but it's on there. So I think my brother learned a lot, and obviously my sister became a guitarist, and she was in the punk band Rubella Ballet in the 80s. And since now she works writing software for a bank. She didn't want to take up a musical career, but she still plays music, you know, hobby. So they're both very musical. You know, one of Leader's songs she plays guitar on is in some sort of TV program or something, a Rubella tune. So, you know, they've both gone on to do musical stuff, but me, not musical at all, I'm afraid.
You were just exposed to an awful lot of different types of music, I guess, growing up.
Yes, and but sadly for me, I always say there is Woolworths in my soul. So, like, my partner's really he loves music and he's into a lot of punk and all this stuff. He goes to gigs all the time and he goes, do you know this band? I'm like, no. Do you know that? No. I said, I don't know why you asked me because I haven't got a clue. But I just like middle of the road. I'd like to pop. I started off with the Osmonds, David Cassidy. I went to Slade, who are brilliant, and then I liked all the glam rock. And then I ended up going out with, it's normally whoever I was going out with, what music they were listening to, I ended up listening to. So I ended up loving Jethro Tull, Aqualung, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Deja Vu. After the Elton John albums, then I went over into all that sort of stuff. And then I got into punk later, and sort of my books describe how that happened, that transition. Why I really was drawn to that. But I've been exposed to a lot. But I wouldn't say. I mean, I used to have stages that we used to listen to Disraeli Gears and Sergeant Pepper. Those are our two albums that we listened to all the time when we were teenagers mucking about. So I do know a lot of Cream songs, but I find it quite painful to listen to Cream.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah,
I find it's sort of difficult, and I find it difficult because it's caused, going forward from the death and the will, and I'm going through stuff with that at the moment, causes a lot of really bad stress. We haven't, we're not floating about having a great time with this. It's been very difficult. So I think that might be the reason that I can't listen to it.
Interesting.
Well, I certainly hope that we're helping and not hindering and get you talking about happy times and all the rest of it. So one of the things that trying to kind of also ask questions and put together some sort of storyboard here. So Linzi was asking questions about obviously the years that were naturally very, very tough and everything, Ginger being away a lot and so on. But to fast forward a good bit to 2005, of course, the Cream reunion, something that I remember really, really well, and so glad after so many years to see them back together. Tell us about that time. Can you remember how you heard that they were getting back together, your dad's reaction to it, and the kind of everything that goes along with that?
Well, it comes in the middle of a very strange time for me, because I had a long-term partner then. We were living in Windsor, and his best friend was a massive Cream fan. So we had this, it suddenly came in probably in the late autumn of 2004. And I began to be contacted by Eric's team, who I remained friendly with, to do with me. They wanted me to sort of liaise with my dad with it. And I can't remember what my dad said, or he obviously told me that this was happening, and my partner was like really over the moon, and he used to answer the phone going, "Oh, Albert Hall box office," and stuff like that. So we were all really, of course, we were absolutely excited. But before that happened, my partner died on Boxing Day of a brain hemorrhage suddenly before he even got to the concert. So I had this massive, oh my God, I've got to move out of the house. I've got a child, that I've got a young child. I think she was 12 then. And so I had this massive thing going on in between. And I was still in the farm then, which was rented from the Crown. And then for the rehearsals, they were rehearsing in Bray, which is near Windsor. And Dad was in a hotel not far from me. So he would then appear. He was at my house every day. And I'd be mucking out my stables because I had horses then, and that's what we did. We had a livery yard. And, I'd just be like this, and then, oh my God, there he was. He'd be standing there. Oh God. And he'd be in the house smoking like a chimney, and he had a pipe in, and it was like Gandalf's in there. We couldn't breathe for smoke. And I'd just feed him and do his washing. My mum would come and help him do his washing, and we took him everywhere. So he practically lived at mine during that rehearsal time. And then, so I was there when the second rehearsal, I think, he came back to mine afterwards and he went, "Oh, Eric got cross." And I said, "Oh," and he said, "Oh, Jack and I nearly had an argument." And Eric was just like, "Oh, it ain't going to be like that now, guys." He was like, "If you two go do that, we're not doing it." So they both thought, "Okay, we better not do that." So that was what happened and then they were all fine. And then we went to one of the rehearsals, and they had to play the tapes back because they didn't remember how things went. And it was like, "Oh yeah," and it was like, "Oh yeah, I used the beaters." They were like, "No," he said, "No, I used the beaters on White Room." And they were like, "Oh, let's hear it." And "Oh yes," And Eric would go, "Are you okay, everybody?" Because he knew they were both ill, really, and he was okay. So he'd go, "Are you all right?" Like two old boys. And he also banned my dad from drinking tea during the performance because he just kept wanting to go for a wee. And it's very famous, many stories of my dad on stage, and I've got one in my book. He starts to play and then he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go for a piss." And Eric was like, "You're not drinking anything because I'm not having you getting up in the middle of the set going to the toilet." True story.
Brilliant.
I think I saw him do that once at a festival.
Yes, many times.
It's because the reason why I asked the question earlier about the kind of relationship between Ginger and Eric, do you feel that to a certain degree, when they were together in the 60s and then when they got back together in 2005, had the dynamic changed a little bit? Like Eric was kind of the boss, where he was the kind of the younger one back in the 60s, but he was the one. I don't know. Do you feel that there's something
that's
in that?
hard for me to say. And they did see each other in the intervening time. And they were in touch, and they saw each other for the. And there's a great little video that I've got of them at the Hall of Fame, and the three of them talk about, "Oh, no one can play Sunshine," and I think it's great because my dad only wanted to play Cream with Cream. But all three of them say no one really gets it. No one knows how to play that song but us, which was really cute. And he did, he had certain things when Eric, was going through his AA sort of stuff and that. But I think they were always in touch, maybe not always socialising, but they socialised throughout the 70s. Then they might have had times, but it's hard for me to comment. There was I know from Eric's reaction from when my dad died, it's not for me to say what a relationship is between two really close friends. I'm not in that relationship, but all I know is, as with my dad and Charlie Watts, it was a very close friendship, and those were his two enduring friends that were with him at the end of his, right at the end. So that's all I can say, really. I can't really comment on something I'm not involved in that relationship, but I know it was close.
Brilliant. You mentioned the word that's come up a couple of times, misconception. What, if you could pinpoint perhaps one of the biggest misconceptions about your dad, what do you think that would be?
well, there are quite a few, aren't there? But I mean, the one that drives me up always, he was a speed freak. Well, he hated amphetamine. I mean, I loved amphetamines, but he liked downers. And he says in Hellraiser, once someone gave him some speed and he went the wrong way to a gig, he got lost. It was the most terrible experience of his life. So he wasn't a speed freak. They say, he saw Ginger play, his hands were bleeding and his drumsticks were tied to his hands. I mean, are you okay? It wasn't. His hands bled, and that was when he was having a hard time, and he wasn't enjoying it because he had to hit the drum so hard to hear what he was playing because of the Marshall stacks behind him. And he used to come home with plasters all over his fingers, and he would say to me, look at this, oh my God, and I'm like, oh, what do you want me to do about it? But I remember that very clearly. And yes, we saw Ginger Baker do a 30-minute drum solo. Oh, don't be stupid. It wasn't that long. I mean, I think Cowie does a 12-minute one or something, but it's you've just made this up, haven't you? And they do. He stabbed Jack Bruce, and the other one, Jack and him hated each other. It's not true. It's just not true. They just argued, but they worked together from 1962 to 2008 consistently. And I've got the emails from Jack at the end of his life. And Jack helped my dad out financially at the end of his life. And then my dad went and said the only reason things went wrong at the Roundhouse tribute, not at the Empire tribute, was because the other drummer wanted the musical direction and we called him Knitting Sawbones, told him how to play his own song. And then had another drummer playing it. I mean, why in God's name would you do that? I don't blame him. All the other musicians, Mark King, Ian Anderson, Jethro Tull, I met him. I was really thrilled at that. But they all came back and said, Bernie Marsden, they all said, no, you should be playing it on your own. They all came back and said that. So in the end, he couldn't play his own song. So he walked off.
Amazing.
Eric wasn't there, was he? Ding.
Yeah. You mentioned Sunshine of Your Love and how no other act could play it. It's actually really kind of, that's perhaps arguably the most reflective in the YouTube clip of Ginger playing with the Buddy Rich big band. Have you seen that?
Yes, he did. Apparently, I wasn't involved in some of those things because he had a manager then who was part of this ongoing thing of people who were trying to isolate him from his family. So some things I didn't get to know about because they were deliberately not letting us know because they were trying to do stuff with him that is not good. But yeah, he said he had a problem at that as well.
Yeah, the band are not playing Sunshine of Your Love correctly, and it's the best of the best. It's the guys in Buddy Rich's. And Ginger standing up, he's telling me, no, it's like this, and he's counting out the time because of the different odd time signature.
Yeah. Oh, that's really... I mean, and you can't blame someone if it's your, people start telling me. I get loads of people telling me, oh, this is what happened with Queen. It's like, you weren't there, and they tell me what happened. Excuse me, this is my house. You're telling me. They tell me things that happened in my own house. They make judgments about my friends and family and people. I just say to them, shall I make some judgments about your family? And I've never met. So that doesn't send me potty, but that's life. Death of the author and all that.
Well, I sincerely hope that you feel that because I've really wanted to make an effort to ensure that we weren't kind of jumping on the bandwagon of, this happened, this because I've read it here. It was important to hear the facts straight from the person who was there at the time, the person who sat on Jimi Hendrix's lap, the daughter of the Hellraiser, and again, gingerbaker.com, which is kind of like I suppose it's the closest of place we can find everything, right? Because if not, there's links to the books and all the rest of it. Yeah,
everything is there, and it is a family-run website. My sister's done it in her spare time. I'm sort of narrated it. The shops, some bits say they're not secure. They are secure. Don't panic. But there are 2 shops on there as well. We've got our T-shirt shops, but we've also got, my mother was a great artist. She did a lot of the album covers. She did the inside of the Air Force album cover. My late mother, who was nuts, but my dad and mum again had an enduring relationship to the end. So, which is good, really. But so everything you want, the Twitter, my daughter runs the Twitter. But the Facebook page is the one that I run. So, but that's all, and links to Cowie, if you're in America, his tour and stuff like whatever you want to know. But then we've got an archive on there. You know, we keep adding bits when we can. I just got a brilliant article from Charlie Watts in 1964 sent to me saying Ginger's the best ever, which is great because he wasn't even in Cream yet then. So I posted, and that's going to go on the website. But I have put it on the Facebook page as well. So yeah,
and I think my favorite quote from you in relation to your family, you said the Osbournes are nothing compared to us. We put the D in dysfunctional, and I think that the crew that put that reality TV show together picked the wrong family.
They did,
because that would have been great.
I want them to make a TV series out of my books. That's what I want. So I need more people to read them.
I don't know who would you have play Ginger Baker? I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh, God, I mean, we did say that, you know, Paul Bettany, but he's getting a bit old now.
Right, okay.
Someone like that.
Okay, brilliant. Well, listen, Nettie, this has been absolutely great. Thoroughly enjoyed it. This is part one. I'm putting that out there. This is going to be part one of a good few because there's so much to talk about. Really, truly appreciate the time, and thanks very much. And make sure everyone log on to gingerbaker.com to buy the books. Hellraiser coupled with Tales of a Rockstar's Daughter, part 1, part 2. Buy them all. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
And by the way, there's just this little bonus story here at the end of this interview. Nettie and I spoke before, years ago, when Ginger Baker was still alive. And I've done lots of different interviews, and this is the only time this has happened. I contacted her, and she was dealing with all these stuff at the time, his PR, etc. And I said, my name's Scott, huge fan, I'd love to interview Ginger. And she got back saying, are you sure you want to do this? Like, really is this the thing that you want to do? And of course I thought, if Ginger Baker is going to verbally abuse me, I will die the happiest man. But it didn't happen. But the next best thing to happen was to speak to his daughter Nettie Baker and for her to give us those phenomenal stories that she's given us just now. And once again, this is going to be part 1 of many, and we can all look forward to that.